My name is Leo Vance. I'm 40 years old and I live here in Denver, Colorado. On paper, my title is Chief Financial Officer of Vance Global, the massive corporation my father, Arthur Vance, built from the ground up. That title sounds impressive, doesn't it? The truth is, I'm nothing more than a figurehead. My father is the one who controls every last thing. I'm just a puppet whose strings he pulls whenever it suits him. I feel like a faint shadow lost in the blinding light of the Vance family name. My own office feels like it's on loan, the heavy oak desk a prop I'm not meant to actually use. I've long accepted that I'm not the strong type. I don't have my father's commanding presence that silences a room. Nor do I have the razor-sharp mind of my younger brother Ethan. The courage to stand up to either of them simply isn't in me. The thought alone makes my throat tighten. So I'm just Leo, the husband, the father. I try my best to fulfill my duties, but I'm haunted by the constant feeling that I'm falling short in every aspect of my life. Every single morning I stand before the bathroom mirror and stare into my own tired eyes, asking the man looking back at me what I'm even doing with my life. He never has an answer. But then I picture my son, Noah, and I know I have to keep pushing forward if only for him. Noah, my son, is 12. He possesses a brilliant mind that moves so fast I sometimes feel left in his dust. He has a constant storm of brown hair that never stays put and bright, curious eyes that look like they're trying to deconstruct the world just to see how it works. His passion is technology, a fierce and focused thing that consumes him. Last year, he took first place in his school's robotics competition. I can still feel the scene as if it were yesterday. The echoey gymnasium, the scent of ozone from all the electronics. I see him spotting me, breaking into a run and crashing into me with a hug that knocked the wind out of my lungs. His face was pure, unrestrained joy as he shouted, "Dad, I did it!" For that one perfect moment holding him, I wasn't the failure my own father sees. I was just a dad. A real one. But moments like that are invisible to my father, Arthur Vance. Or if he does notice them, they don't register as important. To him I am and have always been a profound disappointment. He's 70, but he carries himself with the unyielding strength of a man half his age. His hair is a shock of silver white, and his face is a mask of stern, cold lines that rarely softens. The deep timbre of his voice is a weapon capable of making a grown man, especially me, visibly flinch. He is the architect of Vance Global, a billion-dollar empire built on manufacturing and technology. But I don't see him as just a successful businessman. To me, he is the unwavering patriarch, a domineering force who controls every room he enters, and in my experience, he can be a truly ruthless man. The memories are burned into my mind of him yelling at my mother, Eleanor, his voice thundering through the house while Ethan and I stood frozen. My mother is a gentle soul with blonde hair that has faded to silver over the years and eyes that hold a permanent, quiet sorrow. She has weathered his storms for 40 years of marriage, and I see the exhaustion settle deep in her bones. One night I came downstairs to find her sitting alone in the dark living room clutching a glass of wine, silent tears tracing paths down her cheeks. Every part of me screamed to go to her, to wrap my arms around her and whisper that I knew. I knew what it was like to be suffocated by his shadow, but my feet felt nailed to the floor, the words lodged in my throat. I was paralyzed by that same old fear, that familiar weakness. Ethan, my younger brother, is another world entirely. At 35, he is a carbon copy of our father in his prime, only more polished, more modern. He's tall and effortlessly handsome, armed with a disarming smile that reels people in before they know what's happening. But I've seen that smile enough to know what lies behind it, a sharp, calculating mind. Ethan is the vice president of Vance Global, and in our father's eyes, he is the undisputed heir. He'll often say it at family dinners, his voice booming with pride right across the table from me. Ethan has vision. The words are always a casual stab, a reminder of everything I'm not. And you, Leo, he'll add, turning his dismissive gaze on me, you just sit behind a desk and sign useless papers. I've heard those words, or some version of them, hundreds of times, but they never lose their sting. Each time it's a fresh ache in my chest. It's not that I hate Ethan. If I'm being honest with myself, it's envy, a deep, gnawing jealousy. He has everything I lack: unshakable confidence, our father's unwavering support, and the cold-blooded pragmatism required to not just survive but thrive in the world Arthur Vance built. But I'm not naive. I know Ethan doesn't see me as a brother. He sees me as a placeholder, a minor inconvenience in the grand architectural plans he and our father have for the future. I'm just a name on a letterhead that will one day be erased. Noah, my son, he sees it all so clearly. I know he loves me fiercely, but I also know he despises the way my father treats me. One evening at dinner, after Arthur had spent 10 minutes methodically tearing me down in front of everyone, Noah bolted from the table, ran to his room, and slammed the door so hard the silverware rattled. Later that night, I knocked gently and found him sitting on the edge of his bed, clutching his laptop like a shield. His voice shook when he looked up at me. "Dad, why don't you ever fight back?" he asked, his eyes pleading. "Why do you just let Grandpa say those horrible things to you?" I had no answer for him, none that would make any sense to a boy with his fire. All I could do was sit beside him, pull him into a hug, and whisper into his hair, "I'm sorry, Noah. I'm so sorry. All I want is for things to be okay. For my family. For Noah. But the truth is, nothing is okay. Vance Global is teetering on the edge of a storm, and I can feel the ground shifting beneath my feet. Over the past few months, I've caught fragments of hushed conversations in the hallways, whispers in the boardroom before I enter. The words are always the same. Failed investments, accounting irregularities, intense pressure from the shareholders. I am the chief financial officer. It's my name on the door. Yet my father and Ethan deliberately keep me from seeing any of the critical documents. I'm handed sanitized numbers and polished reports that paint a picture of stability, but my gut screams that it's a lie. I know something is fundamentally wrong, but I can't bring myself to demand answers. I just don't have it in me. I'm afraid. I'm terrified that if I question them, my father will fix me with that familiar look of utter contempt, and Ethan will flash that condescending smirk that says, "You really are a fool, aren't you?" Every morning, walking into the office feels like stepping onto a battlefield without armor or a weapon. I see it in the way the employees look at me, a mixture of pity and, even worse, suspicion. They all know I hold no real power. They know exactly who runs Vance Global. Noah is my only anchor. He's the one person in my life who makes me feel like I still have some worth. He'll sit with me for hours, talking excitedly about his tech projects. He tells me how he programmed a small robot to automatically pick up trash from his bedroom floor, or the time he bypassed the school's network security. Just to mess with his friends, of course. I always laugh and tell him how brilliant he is, but underneath, a cold knot of worry tightens in my stomach. He's too smart, too curious for his own good. I have this recurring fear that one day he'll start digging into the secrets of this family, and his curiosity will lead him somewhere dark and dangerous. One evening, I was sitting in my study staring blankly at a stack of papers on my desk, the numbers blurring into meaningless shapes. The door creaked open and Noah walked in, holding up a small USB drive like a trophy. His eyes were lit with that familiar fire. "Dad, you have to see this," he said, his voice buzzing with enthusiasm. "I wrote a program that can analyze huge sets of data. Imagine if I could run this on Grandpa's company files. I bet I could find ways to save money or even catch some errors in the books. I forced a smile, but a wave of profound unease washed over me. I reached out and ruffled his hair. "Noah, that's incredible. You're so smart," I said, my voice softer than I intended. "But the company, it's a lot more complicated than you think. Let's just have you focus on school for now, okay?" He looked up at me and I saw a flicker of disappointment cloud his bright eyes. "Dad, I just want to help," he said quietly. "I know you're not happy, I can see it." Noah's words were a clean, sharp cut right through my heart. I wanted to tell him I was fine, that I had everything under control, but the lie wouldn't come. I couldn't lie to him, not to Noah. That night, sleep was impossible. I lay in bed listening to the distant hum of the city, a sound that always made me feel small and insignificant. My thoughts drifted to my mother and all the years she had silently endured my father's tyranny. I thought about Noah and the desperate, aching need I felt to protect him from growing up in the suffocating shadow of this family. And then I thought about myself, a 40-year-old man who still felt like a terrified little boy whenever his father entered the room. It was a Tuesday, a day that began with a deceptive sense of normalcy. I made the familiar drive to the Vance Global headquarters in downtown Denver, where the glass-walled skyscrapers threw blinding reflections of the morning sun. My office was on the 20th floor, a huge, sterile room with a panoramic window overlooking the city and the mountains beyond. The view was supposed to be a symbol of power, but it never made me feel anything but small. On the contrary, the vast space and the expensive furniture only amplified my sense of being an imposter, a child placed in a chair far too large for him. I sat down at the heavy mahogany desk, opened my laptop, and tried to focus on the financial reports. The numbers swam before my eyes, a meaningless jumble. I knew with a certainty that settled like lead in my gut that they had been manipulated, scrubbed clean by my father's and Ethan's loyal accounting team. I was just the final checkpoint, the soulless rubber stamp that gave it all a veneer of legitimacy. Anytime I'd ever tried to question an unusual expense or an unclear transaction, my father would cut me off with a wave of his hand. "Leo, just do your job. Leave the important decisions to me and Ethan." And Ethan, with that trademark smirk playing on his lips, would add, "Don't worry, big brother, we've got it all under control." But that morning something was different. The air in the office was thick with a tension I could almost taste. Employees were huddled in hushed conversations in the hallways, their eyes darting away whenever I approached. When I walked into the boardroom for the quarterly shareholders meeting, my father and Ethan were already seated at the head of the long table, their postures rigid. My father, dressed in an impeccably tailored gray suit, fixed me with a stare that felt like a physical blow. Ethan, as always, wore a smug smile, but I saw a faint tremor of tension in the way his fingers drummed a restless rhythm on the polished wood. "Leo," my father began, his voice low and commanding, a tone that instantly made the hairs on my arms stand up. "Today we need to have a serious conversation." I swallowed against a suddenly dry throat, the feeling of being a schoolboy summoned to the principal's office washing over me. "Yes, sir," I managed, fighting to keep my voice from shaking. "What's this about?" My father didn't answer right away. Instead, he slid a thick stack of documents across the table toward me. "Open it and see for yourself," he said, his voice as cold and hard as ice. My hands were trembling as I reached for the file. It was a financial report, but not like any of the sanitized versions I was used to seeing. These pages were covered in red ink, with bolded numbers and handwritten notes highlighting enormous irregular expenses and a series of transfers to offshore accounts with no clear origin. My blood ran cold. And there, at the bottom of every single damning page, was my signature. The signature I had mindlessly scrawled hundreds, maybe thousands of times because my father had always said, Just sign it, Leo. Don't waste everyone's time. What is this? I whispered, my voice barely audible. My voice faltered, my heart starting to hammer against my ribs. This, my father said, leaning forward and emphasizing each word with chilling precision, is proof that you have embezzled $10 million from this company. The world around me tilted and went silent. All I could hear was the frantic roaring rush of blood in my ears. I felt dizzy, disoriented. What? I stammered, shaking my head in disbelief. Dad, I would never do something like that. Ethan cut in, his voice as smooth as silk but laced with a cruel, mocking tone. Leo, don't play the innocent card. We've checked everything. All of these transactions were routed through accounts you control. Your signature is on every single transfer authorization. My hands shook so badly I could barely turn the pages. I flipped through the documents, my eyes scanning desperately for some clue, some mistake, some rational explanation. But the numbers and the dense lines of text were a dizzying maze with no way out. A cold sweat trickled down my spine, soaking the collar of my shirt. Dad, I swear to you, I don't know anything about this, I said, my voice cracking, pleading. I just did what you and Ethan told me to do. I just signed what you put in front of me. My father slammed his hand on the table, and the explosive sound made me flinch violently in my chair. Do not make excuses, Leo, he roared, his face turning a dark, dangerous shade of red. You are the chief financial officer. You are responsible. Or are you trying to tell us you're so incompetent, so utterly useless that you had no idea where $10 million of the company's money was going? I couldn't form a response. The words wouldn't come. I just sat there, frozen, feeling the entire world collapsing in on me, crushing me under its weight. Ethan looked at me then, his eyes cold and predatory, like a snake watching its cornered prey. Leo, he said, his voice dripping with false concern. If you just confess, we might be able to salvage the family's reputation. Don't drag this out and make it worse for everyone. A primal scream built in my chest. I wanted to leap up, to slam my fists on the table, to run out of that suffocating room and never look back. But I was paralyzed. I just sat there, my mind a complete blank, feeling like an animal caught in a steel trap. My father stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He glared down at me with an expression of pure, undiluted contempt. Get ready to go to prison, you useless fool, he spat. And don't you dare expect me to go easy on you just because you're my son. They left. The heavy door clicked shut behind them, and I remained seated, my trembling hands still clutching the stack of papers that had just destroyed my life. I didn't know what to do. I had no evidence, no allies, no way to fight back against the perfect airtight cage they had built around me. All I knew for certain was that this was their doing. My father and Ethan had orchestrated this whole thing. They needed a scapegoat, someone to take the fall to protect Vance Global from whatever disaster was looming, or worse, to protect themselves. I drove home in a daze, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. My house, which had always been my one place of peace, offered no comfort. It felt alien, like the walls were closing in. Chloe, my wife, was in the kitchen preparing dinner. She turned the moment I walked in, immediately sensing that something was terribly wrong. Leo, what is it? She asked, setting down her knife. You look like you've seen a ghost. I told her everything. Every word my father had said, every cold, triumphant glance from Ethan. She listened intently, her grip on my hand tightening with every detail. Leo, you didn't do anything wrong, she said when I finished, her voice firm and unwavering. We'll find a way through this. You cannot let them pin this on you. But I wasn't so sure. I felt like I was sinking in quicksand, caught in a trap so perfectly designed I couldn't see any way to escape. That evening, I couldn't touch my food. I just sat in the living room, staring out the window into the darkness, my mind racing, desperately trying to find a way out of the maze. But every path I explored, every possibility I considered led me back to the same terrifying conclusion. I wasn't strong enough to confront my father and Ethan. I never had been. Late that night, long after Chloe had gone to bed, I heard soft footsteps on the hardwood floor. Noah appeared in the doorway wearing his favorite pajamas covered in tiny robots. "Dad, I heard Mom on the phone," he said, his voice quiet but resolute. "You didn't do what they said, did you?" I looked at my son and my heart felt like it was being squeezed in a vice. "Noah, I hesitated, the words getting stuck in my throat. "I don't even know what's happening anymore." He walked over and sat down on the sofa next to me. He looked me straight in the eye. "I believe you," he said, his voice shining with a conviction that I hadn't felt in myself for years. "And I'm going to help you. I promise." I managed a weak, sad smile, thinking he was just a sweet kid trying to comfort his dad. The last thing I wanted was for Noah to get mixed up in this. He was only 12, far too young and too good to be exposed to the dark, ugly secrets of the Vance family. The next morning, I got a call from my mother. Her voice trembled over the line. "Leo, you need to be so careful," she whispered, as if she were afraid of being overheard. "Your father, he's planning something. I don't know all the details, but it doesn't feel right. It feels dangerous." I wanted to press her for more information, to ask what she'd heard, but she hung up abruptly, as if terrified someone might walk in and catch her. Her call confirmed it. A cold certainty settled in my stomach. My father and Ethan didn't just want to push me out of the company, they wanted to utterly destroy me. And in that moment, I knew that if I didn't find a way to fight back, I would lose everything. My reputation, my family, and Noah's future. But I had no idea where to even begin. In the days that followed, I moved through my life like a ghost. I went to work silently, sat in my office staring at the walls, and drove home silently to our house in the suburbs, where Chloe and Noah were waiting. Chloe did her best to maintain a sense of normalcy, cooking dinners I couldn't bring myself to eat. Noah would just watch me, his eyes full of a quiet concern that felt both like a comfort and a burden, as if he were trying to reassure me that it would all be okay. But I wasn't okay, not at all. I was just Leo Vance, a weak man trapped in his father's shadow, about to be crushed by it for good. There were only a few days left until I had to appear in court and somehow defend myself against an indefensible accusation. The subpoena had arrived at our house the previous week. A stark white envelope that felt like a cold dagger being plunged into my heart. I had barely slept since. Night after night, I found myself sitting motionless in my study, the desk lamp casting a lonely circle of light on the stack of documents my father had thrown at me. I tried to dissect every detail, to trace every number, desperately searching for a tiny loophole, a faint glimmer of hope in the overwhelming maze of figures and signatures. But it was hopeless. My father and Ethan had been too meticulous, too ruthless in their planning. They had constructed a perfect trap, and I was the flawless scapegoat they had designed to fit inside it. Every forged financial report was an expert fabrication, and the fraudulent transactions I knew nothing about were all authorized with my own signature. I felt like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, the ground crumbling away with every breath, bringing me closer and closer to the dark, empty void waiting below. On the morning of the trial, my body felt like it didn't belong to me. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror trying to tie my tie, but my hands trembled so violently that I couldn't manage the simple knot. Chloe walked in and gently placed her hand on my shoulder, her touch a small point of warmth in my cold, numb world. "Leo, you'll get through this," she said, her voice steady and reassuring. But her eyes couldn't hide the deep worry she felt. I managed a weak smile, trying to shield her from the sheer terror that was consuming me. The trial was held at the federal courthouse in downtown Denver. As I stepped into the courtroom, the cold, sterile air made me shiver. The polished wooden benches, the harsh fluorescent lights overhead, the low murmur of the crowd. It all felt like it was pressing down on me, suffocating me. My father, Arthur Vance, sat in the front row. His expensive suit couldn't conceal the icy, merciless glint in his eyes. Ethan, my brother, sat right beside him, wearing that same smug, triumphant smile I had seen 100 times before. They were predators, and I was their cornered prey. The judge, a serious-looking older man with a grim face, banged his gavel, the sharp sound echoing through the silent room. My father's legal team, the most expensive and ruthless lawyers Vance Global could afford, rose to present their case. They produced endless stacks of documents, financial reports bearing my signature, wire transfers to offshore accounts I had never even heard of. Leo Vance, the lead attorney declared, his voice as smooth and venomous as a snake's, has systematically embezzled $10 million from company funds, causing irreparable damage to Vance Global and its shareholders. I sat beside my own lawyer, an old friend from college who was the only person willing to take my case for a fee I could actually afford. He did his best to defend me, trying to question the authenticity of the documents, but I could see it was a hopeless fight. He was one man against an army. Ethan was called to the witness stand. With his handsome, trustworthy face and his persuasive, confident tone, he spun a meticulously crafted tale of my betrayal. He told the court that I had been secretly siphoning off funds for years, that I had abused my position as CFO for my own personal gain. "I am deeply sorry to have to say this," Ethan said, letting out a practiced sigh and lowering his gaze as if he were genuinely heartbroken. "But my own brother has betrayed our family, and he has betrayed our company." I wanted to scream. I wanted to leap to my feet and shout that it was all a lie, a monstrous, calculated lie. But I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I just sat there, feeling the walls of the courtroom closing in, the world collapsing around me. My father looked directly at me, and his cold, hard gaze said everything. "You deserve this, Leo. You've always been a failure." I bowed my head, my breathing shallow and ragged, as if all the air was being sucked out of the room. Just as my lawyer was preparing to call me to the stand for what felt like my own execution, a small but clear, resolute voice cut through the tense silence from the back of the courtroom. "Your Honor, I have evidence." My head snapped up, my heart suddenly hammering against my ribs. It was Noah. He was standing there in his school uniform, his brown hair a chaotic mess, his eyes blazing with fierce determination. Chloe was beside him, her hand on his arm, trying to pull him back, but he shook her off and took a bold step forward toward the judge's bench. "I'm Noah Vance," he announced, his voice ringing with startling confidence. "Leo Vance is my dad, and I have evidence that proves he's innocent." The courtroom erupted into chaos. My father shot to his feet, his face turning a deep, furious red. "What is this boy doing here?" he bellowed, his voice trembling with rage. "Get him out of here! This is a court of law, not a playground!" Ethan frowned, trying to look merely annoyed, but for the first time ever I saw a flicker of raw panic in his eyes. It was a look I had never seen on him before. The judge banged his gavel again and again, his voice rising above the noise. "Order! Order in the court!" When the room settled, he looked down at Noah, his expression serious but not unkind. "Young man, you say you have evidence? Explain yourself." Noah took a deep breath, his small shoulders squaring, and he stepped forward, holding up a small USB drive for the judge to see. "I have video footage and internal documents proving that my grandfather, Arthur Vance, and my uncle, Ethan Vance, set up my dad to take the fall for them." The blood turned to ice in my veins. "Noah," I whispered, trying to get to my feet, but my lawyer put a firm hand on my arm, holding me back. Chloe looked at me from across the room, her eyes wide with fear and worry, but I knew in that instant there was no stopping him now. He was determined. And in that moment, I realized that my son wasn't just a smart, curious boy. He was 100 times braver than I had ever been in my entire life. Noah began to speak, his voice clear and steady, with a command that was utterly astonishing for a 12-year-old. "I love technology. I mess around with it all the time," he said, his eyes sweeping across the stunned courtroom. "A few months ago, I secretly installed a miniature camera in my grandfather's home office. I know I shouldn't have, but I didn't mean any harm. I wanted to see how he worked. I thought maybe I could learn something from him." The courtroom was utterly silent now, every single person staring at my son. I saw my father clench his fists so hard his knuckles turned white, his face draining of all color. Beside him, Ethan had started drumming his fingers on the arm of his chair, a nervous, frantic rhythm. "Last week," Noah continued, his voice unwavering, "I decided to review the footage from the camera, and I overheard a conversation between my grandfather and my uncle Ethan. They were talking about the company's financial problems. They talked about framing my dad. They said he was the perfect scapegoat to save the company from a federal investigation." Noah held up the small USB drive as if it were a sword, but he wasn't finished. "I also found some important documents," he said, his voice gaining even more confidence. "One day when Grandpa wasn't home, I went into his office. I knew his computer had security on it, but, well, I hacked into it." Noah hesitated for a fraction of a second, as if he was suddenly aware that he was confessing to a crime himself. "I learned how to crack passwords from the robotics club at school," he admitted. "I found emails between Grandpa and Uncle Ethan, and I found the real unedited accounting files. They proved that they were the ones who falsified the books to frame my dad." A low buzz of murmurs swept through the courtroom. My father shot to his feet again, his voice cracking with rage. "This boy is lying. He's just a child. How could he possibly hack into my computer?" But the judge simply raised a hand, silencing him and motioning for him to sit back down. Noah handed the USB drive to the court clerk, and a moment later, a large screen was wheeled into place. When the video began to play, my father's voice filled the courtroom, cold and ruthless. "Pin it all on Leo. He's useless anyway. Let him take the fall for us. I've already told the accounting team to manipulate the numbers. His signature is on everything. No one will suspect a thing." Then Ethan's voice followed, smooth, smug, and utterly assured. "All right, Dad. I'll make sure the board believes Leo is the traitor. Once he's out of the way, we'll be able to get through this investigation without any trouble." My heart felt like it seized in my chest. Hearing those words spoken aloud, those cold, calculated daggers confirmed everything I had feared for so long. My own father and brother didn't just want to push me out of the company. They wanted to completely obliterate me. I looked at Noah standing there so small but radiating a power that filled the entire room. He was a warrior, facing down the world for me. The judge then requested to see the documents Noah had retrieved. The emails and accounting files flashed onto the screen with transactions clearly highlighted, showing exactly how my father and Ethan had cooked the books. There were the transfers to the offshore accounts, the massive expenses without a single invoice attached, all of it expertly forged to make it look like I was the one responsible. My father tried to object, but his voice faltered, stripped of its usual booming authority. Ethan just sat there silently, his face a pale, sickly color, his trademark smirk finally wiped away. The judge announced a recess to verify the legality of Noah's evidence. I looked at my son, a tidal wave of gratitude and terror washing over me. He had done what I had never dared to even dream of doing. He had fought back, but I also knew with a sickening certainty that his brave actions had just put both of us in an incredibly dangerous position. During the recess, I pulled Noah into a corner of the hallway and hugged him so tightly I could feel his heart beating against my chest. "You were amazing," I whispered, my voice choked with emotion. "But you have to be so careful now, Grandpa. He will never forgive this." Noah pulled back just enough to look up at me, his eyes still blazing with that incredible fire. "I'm not scared, Dad," he said, his voice firm. "I just want to protect you." I hugged him again, tighter this time, feeling a surge of strength I hadn't known was possible. It was a strength that came directly from him. In that moment, I knew that no matter what happened next, I wouldn't let my son fight this battle alone. When the trial resumed, the judge returned to the bench with a grim, stern expression. He announced that Noah's evidence, both the video footage from the miniature camera and the documents obtained from my father's computer, had been preliminarily verified. "We will need more time to fully assess the legality and authenticity of this evidence," he said, his voice ringing with authority. "But what has been presented here today is sufficient to temporarily suspend all charges against Mr. Leo Vance. This trial will be continued next week with the involvement of forensic accounting and technical experts to fully analyze the new evidence." My father shot to his feet, his face flushed with a deep, mottled red. "This is a farce," he bellowed, pointing a trembling finger at Noah. "That boy broke into my private property. This evidence is illegal and inadmissible." Ethan chimed in, his voice attempting its usual smoothness but betraying a new, high-strung tension. "Your Honor, we request that this so-called evidence be dismissed immediately. A 12-year-old boy cannot possibly be considered a credible witness in a federal court." My lawyer, David, stood up to object. "Your Honor, the evidence presented is clear and verifiable. We request that the court summon additional witnesses from Vance Global's accounting department to clarify these transactions under oath." The judge nodded, jotted down a note, and then banged his gavel to end the session. As the room began to clear, I looked over at my father. He was staring directly at me and Noah, and his gaze was as sharp and as cold as a blade. I knew without a doubt that he would not stop. This was far from over. The days that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and anxious, suffocating days. Chloe and I tried to keep Noah home from school, terrified that my father might try to retaliate in some way. But Noah was resolute, insisting that he wouldn't hide. "If I act scared, then Grandpa wins, Dad," he said, his voice filled with that unshakable determination. I didn't understand how a 12-year-old boy could possess more strength than I did. But I knew I had to find my own. I had to try. For Noah, for Chloe, and for myself. David, my lawyer, worked tirelessly. He managed to track down several former accounting employees from Vance Global, people who had left the company because they couldn't withstand the constant pressure from my father and Ethan. One of them, a woman named Sarah, agreed to testify. Sarah had been the head of the accounting department but had quit after my father forced her to do things that went against her conscience. In a series of secret meetings in David's office, Sarah confirmed everything. She told us that my father and Ethan had personally instructed her to manipulate the financial records, creating a web of fake transactions specifically designed to frame me. "I didn't want to do it," Sarah said, her voice trembling with the memory. "But Mr. Vance, he threatened to ruin my career, to make sure I never worked in this city again if I didn't comply." The new evidence began to pile up, piece by piece. David hired a team of forensic tech experts to analyze the files Noah had pulled from my father's computer. They quickly confirmed that the accounting documents had been systematically altered, with falsified timestamps added to make the fraudulent transactions appear recent. Furthermore, they authenticated the footage from Noah's miniature camera, verifying that there were absolutely no signs of digital tampering. Each new piece of evidence was another brick in the wall being built to protect me, but I still felt a deep, gnawing unease. My father was a powerful man with a network of connections I couldn't even begin to imagine. He could bribe, he could intimidate, He could do whatever it took to turn the tables back in his favor. The next court session, held a week later, was even more tense than the first. My father and Ethan had hired a new, even more aggressive legal team, led by a man notorious for his ability to overturn seemingly hopeless cases. They immediately went on the attack, viciously challenging the legitimacy of Noah's evidence, arguing that his hacking and the installation of the camera were criminal acts that violated my father's privacy. A child cannot be considered a reliable source of information, my father's new lawyer said, his voice dripping with condescending sarcasm. It's far more likely the boy was manipulated, possibly by the defendant himself, Mr. Leo Vance. I clenched my fists so hard under the table my knuckles ached, fighting to suppress a surge of pure rage. David calmly countered, presenting Sarah's sworn testimony and the detailed reports from the tech experts. These documents weren't just taken from Mr. Arthur Vance's computer, Your Honor, David said, his voice firm and steady. They have now been corroborated by independent expert analysis and a credible witness with first-hand knowledge. The falsified transactions may bear Mr. Leo Vance's signature, but there is absolutely no evidence that he was the one who directly executed them. Then Noah was called to the witness stand, and for a moment my heart felt like it stopped beating. My small boy, dressed in his school uniform, stood before the entire courtroom. But he showed no sign of fear. He calmly recounted how he had installed the tiny camera in my father's home office and how he had used the skills he learned in his robotics club to get past the security on the computer. I just wanted to protect my dad, Noah said, his voice clear and unwavering. I knew he didn't do it. I knew he didn't do anything wrong, and I wasn't going to let Grandpa and Uncle Ethan destroy him. The courtroom was so silent you could hear Noah's soft breathing through the microphone. The judge looked down at him, and for the first time I saw his stern expression soften slightly. Young man, you do understand that what you did, hacking into a computer, recording someone without their knowledge, may have broken the law, don't you? He asked gently. Noah nodded. Yes, Your Honor, but I felt like I had no other choice. I just wanted the truth to come out. I looked at my son, my heart swelling with a mixture of pride and a profound, aching sadness. He had put his own future on the line to save me. I wanted to run up there and pull him into a hug to tell him how sorry I was for not being strong enough to protect myself, forcing him into this impossible position. But all I could do was sit there, frozen, waiting for fate to deliver its verdict. In the subsequent hearings, the tide slowly but surely began to turn in my favor. Sarah testified, her voice shaking but firm, detailing exactly how my father and Ethan had coerced her into falsifying the company's financial records. The tech experts presented their final analysis, proving conclusively that the fraudulent transactions had originated from a computer in Ethan's office, not mine. My father tried to argue, to bluster his way out of it, but his voice lacked all of its former power and authority. Ethan was almost completely silent, his gaze distant and unfocused, as if he knew the game was finally over. On the day of the verdict, the judge stood, his voice ringing with clarity in the silent courtroom. Based on the overwhelming evidence presented, this court finds Mr. Leo Vance not guilty of the charge of embezzlement. All charges against him are hereby dismissed. A low buzz swept through the courtroom. I felt a weight I didn't even realize I was carrying lift from my chest, and I could suddenly breathe again. Chloe gripped my hand, silent tears streaming down her cheeks. Noah ran to me and threw his arms around my waist, hugging me with all his might. Dad, I knew you'd be okay, he said, his voice choked with emotion. I watched as my father and Ethan were led out of the courtroom in handcuffs. Just before he disappeared through the doors, my father gave me one last look. His eyes were no longer filled with contempt, but with a hollow, stunned emptiness, as if he couldn't possibly believe that he had lost. Ethan kept his head bowed, refusing to meet anyone's gaze. They were both charged with financial fraud and conspiracy, facing years in prison and massive reparations to Vance Global. As we walked out of the courthouse and into the bright sunlight, I pulled Noah and Chloe into a hug, feeling as though I had been given a second chance at life. I had reclaimed my name, my honor, not just for myself but for my family. But deep down, I knew this victory wasn't really mine. It belonged to Noah, the 12-year-old boy who had bravely stood up to an empire to protect his father. More than a year has passed since the trial ended. I'm standing at the window of our home in the Denver suburbs, looking out at the small garden where Noah is tinkering with a new homemade robot. He lets out a loud, happy laugh as the robot wobbles and then successfully picks up a fallen leaf, and I can't help but smile. For the first time in as long as I can remember, I feel a genuine sense of peace, as if the invisible chains that had bound me for my entire life have finally, truly been broken. The trial was over, the truth was out, and I, Leo Vance, was no longer a criminal in anyone's eyes. But it was more than that. I was no longer a prisoner in my own head. The official verdicts for my father, Arthur Vance, and my brother, Ethan, were announced on a cold autumn morning. My father was sentenced to 7 years in a federal prison for financial fraud and obstruction of justice, along with a massive fine to compensate Vance Global. Ethan, as his accomplice, received a 5-year sentence. I wasn't at the courthouse when the judge read the sentences, but David, my lawyer, called to tell me the news. They didn't say a word, Leo, he told me. Arthur just sat there, silent, and Ethan kept his head down the whole time. I think they knew there was no way out. I didn't feel the sense of vindication I thought I would. Instead, there was just a quiet, hollow emptiness. My father had once been the man whose approval I craved and whose anger I feared above all else. Ethan was my brother, the one I had always foolishly hoped would one day see me as family. But they had chosen their paths, and there was nothing I could do to change that. All I knew for sure was that from that day forward I would live my life for myself and for the people I loved. Vance Global, in the aftermath of the storm, descended into chaos. The board of directors asked me to stay, even offering me the position of chairman to lead the company through the crisis. They said I had proven my integrity and resilience, that I was the right person to rebuild the empire my father had nearly destroyed. But every time I stepped back into my old office, I felt like I was suffocating. The towering glass walls, the endless tense meetings, the scrutinizing stares of the employees. It all just reminded me of the decades I had spent living in my father's shadow. I knew with a clarity that surprised me that I didn't belong there anymore. One evening, I sat down with Chloe and Noah and told them about the decision I had been mulling over for weeks. I want to resign, I said, my voice soft but certain. I'm not cut out for the cutthroat competition, the endless scheming, the constant power struggles. I want to do something that's truly my own. Chloe took my hand, her eyes filled with nothing but love and support. What do you want to do, Leo? She asked. I smiled, a real smile that reached my eyes, feeling for a moment like I was 20 again, back when I still had dreams my father hadn't yet crushed. I want to open a small restaurant, I said. I've always loved cooking. Ever since I was a kid, I wanted to be in the kitchen experimenting with recipes, making food that brings people joy. But Dad, he always said a man should aim for bigger things, not waste his time hiding in a kitchen. Noah looked up from his laptop, his eyes sparkling with excitement. Dad, that's awesome. I want to eat pizza that you make. He let out a loud, happy laugh, and I couldn't help but laugh with him. Chloe nodded, placing her hand on my shoulder. If that's what you want, then I'm with you, she said, always. I submitted my resignation a week later. The board tried to convince me to stay, to reconsider, but my mind was made up. I handed over my responsibilities to Sarah, the former head of accounting who had so bravely testified at the trial. Sarah was a smart, honest woman, and she had the strength and integrity to guide Vance Global through its turbulent recovery. I knew the company would be in good hands with her at the helm. As I walked out of that glass skyscraper for the very last time, I felt a physical weight lift from my shoulders. I was no longer the CFO, no longer my father's puppet. I was just Leo, an ordinary man finally ready to start a new life. My small restaurant, which I named Leo's Table, opened on a quiet street corner here in Denver, not far from our house. It wasn't anywhere near as fancy as the expensive, stuffy restaurants my father used to drag me to, but it was mine. I spent hours in the kitchen experimenting with new bread recipes, making marinara sauce from scratch with fresh tomatoes, and baking fragrant apple pies that filled the whole space with the scent of cinnamon. Each dish felt like a little piece of me, a dream I had buried in childhood that was finally being brought back to life. Customers started coming. At first, it was just a few friends and neighbors, but then gradually word began to spread. They praised the food, the cozy, warm atmosphere of the little restaurant, and I realized with a deep and profound sense of gratitude that for the first time in my entire life, I was doing something I truly loved. My mother, Eleanor, had changed too. After the trial, she filed for divorce from my father. "I've put up with him for far too long," she told me one afternoon when she stopped by the restaurant. "I want to live for myself now, Leo, and I want to be close to you and Noah." I invited her to come live with us in our warm, happy home. Chloe and Noah welcomed her with open arms, and for the first time in my memory, I saw my mother smile without that familiar deep trace of sadness in her eyes. Our house was suddenly filled with laughter. Noah was still busy with his endless tech projects, but he often joined me in the kitchen to help, though most of the time he was just sneaking bites of whatever I was cooking. Chloe, with the incredible organizational skills I had always admired, took over managing the restaurant's finances and operations. My mother loved to sit in a quiet corner of the dining room, reading her books and chatting with the regular customers, as if she were rediscovering a freedom she had lost decades ago. We were no longer living under constant pressure, no longer oppressed by harsh words and contemptuous glares. We were finally free. We were just a family living a simple, happy life. One evening, long after the last customer had left the restaurant, I was standing on our back porch looking out at the city lights shimmering in the distance. Noah came out and handed me a mug of hot cocoa. "Dad, I think you did the right thing," he said, his voice soft but sincere. "I like seeing you happy like this." I pulled him into a hug, my heart overflowing with a love so immense it almost hurt. "Thank you, Noah," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "If it weren't for you, I have no idea where I would be right now." He smiled and rested his head on my shoulder. "Dad," he whispered, "I just wanted you to be free." And I was. I was finally free. I was no longer my father's puppet, no longer a faint shadow of the Vance global empire. I was Leo Vance, a husband, a father, a chef, and above all, a man who had finally found himself again. Leo's Table wasn't just a restaurant, it was my new home, a place where I was building dreams that no one could ever take away from me. The city was still busy, the mountains still loomed in the distance, but I no longer felt small standing before the world. I finally felt like I was a part of it. I had found my place, and I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my soul, that no matter what life threw at me, I would never ever let myself be imprisoned again.